Welcome to Compass Points, the weekly podcast for CompassKnox.com. CompassKnox.com is your best source for news and politics in Knoxville and Knox County. Your hosts today are Scott Barker and Jesse Mayshark, the founders of CompassKnox.com. You can find their daily in-depth coverage and subscribe at CompassKnox.com. The Compass Point podcast is brought to you in conjunction with Almost an Agreement. Almost an Agreement is a layman's attempt to get a handle on the workings in government and politics that we deal with every day. Check them out at almostanagreement.com or subscribe for free on your favorite podcast provider. If you'd like to learn more about the topics discussed on today's podcast, go to CompassKnox.com and subscribe for in-depth coverage and much more. And now, here are your hosts, Scott and Jesse from CompassKnox.com.
Welcome back again to Compass Points, the weekly podcast where we talk about Knoxville news, government, politics, business, education, anything that gets our attention. I am Jesse Mayshark, co-founder and co-publisher of Compass at CompassKnox.com, which covers all of the above. Joined, as usual, by Scott Barker, also co-publisher and co-founder of Compass. How are you doing today, Scott?
I'm doing great, Jesse. We've had an exciting week with early voting beginning and some other things going on. Mm-hmm. So it's been kind of fun to be a journalist this week, and looking forward to the next one. So,
well, I am a little bit puzzled this morning. We're taping this on Friday morning. A couple of days ago, as you probably know, Robbie Robertson of the Band died. You know, he was 80 years old, guitarist, songwriter, sort of famously contentious person. Everything about the Band is a little bit contentious. But I've been going back and listening to the Band, you know, as you do when somebody notable dies. I love the Band. Great music, great songs, whoever deserves the credit for them. And I discovered something that has shaken me a little bit. Do you know the song The Weight? It's one of the most famous Band songs. Take a load off, Annie.
Absolutely, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Did you know that chorus is not, as I have always heard it and sung it when I'm singing along, take a load off Annie? It is take a load off Fanny with an F. Did you know that?
I did not know that.
I don't know if many people know that. It comes off of the F at the end of off into Fanny, and so you kind of don't hear it. But I feel like this has completely rewritten my understanding of the song. All these years I thought it was about Annie, and it turns out it's about somebody completely different.
Why did you ruin that for me?
I know.
Well, if you want to hear the fun part is, I think first handful of times I heard the song and got into it, I always thought Fatty. For some reason, the T came out to me, and I was very confused on who they're calling Fatty in this way. I felt a little Queen reference and some other stuff going on in there, but I didn't know.
Well, at least you picked up on the F. Apparently, there's an F in there, and there is a line later in the song where he says something about my sweet Fanny, where it's more obvious, and somehow I never made that connection. So anyway, I'm still wrapping my head around that, but we do have other things to talk about here.
I actually had kind of one of those weird, interesting things. I was talking to somebody who will remain nameless, and and said to them that Robbie Robertson died, and this is a person who knows music and didn't make the connection, probably because I'm not the biggest music scholar or I love music, but it's my knowledge of music is more narrow than yours, certainly, and a lot of other people's. But I said Robbie Robertson died, and they went, who? I said Robbie. They might have thought I was talking about somebody from Knoxville. I don't know, and said, Robbie Robertson from the Band. And they said, what band? And then I was like, the Band, Robbie Robertson. And they went, oh, and they were kind of embarrassed.
One of those who's on first.
But in most music conversations, the roles would have been switched because, especially, well, not with the Band in bands from that era, but certainly more recent additions to the music scene that I've never heard of. And
right, you're not the one that people necessarily expect to be talking about.
No, I'm the
music trivia.
I'm the guy who watches Saturday Night Live and goes, "Who's that?"
Right.
When they're about the musical guest. Anyway, okay, forget about that. We need to move on to real news.
Real news. We are going to be talking about Sesame Street for reasons that we will get to. Also, a very interesting report on special education services in Knox County schools that came out this week. As you alluded to, early voting started this week. We're going to talk about that a little bit and the Knoxville mayor's race. But to start everything off, we had some serious weather events here this past week, and I thought it was just worth mentioning. Of course, we had very severe storms come through on Monday, including a tornado.
Yeah. In fact, my sister-in-law and her husband weren't ground zero, but they were, ground 0.5 maybe. They lived really close because it was out in West Knox County, and saw the funnel cloud, and
wow,
trees were down all over their neighborhood. They were spared. They didn't have any. The trees that fell in their yard didn't fall on their house, which was good, but they did have to spend a couple of nights in a hotel. So
yeah, a lot of people,
a big deal,
especially out in that area, the tornado, which the National Weather Service identified as an EF2 tornado, which is the third highest of 6 categories. It does qualify as a strong tornado, so not just playing around. Seemed to start sort of in the Hardin Valley area and then blew out along Yarnell Road, across Lovell Road, and particularly an apartment complex there at Lovell.
Right.
Lovell Crossing Apartments had a lot of damage, a lot of people displaced. I think a total of about 400 people at least, temporarily displaced by the damage out there.
Yeah, that's what I think it was KPD was saying, or KFD, the Knoxville Fire Department was saying that. And then, of course, I think a lot of people had to go, and not just in that area, it was from all over the county, had to their power was out and out for an extended period, and ended up going and staying in hotels and things like that.
I had friends with trees on their houses, friends with trees on their cars. So definitely it was a real storm. And sure, it's summer. We get summertime thunderstorms. We're all used to that. That's a well-established pattern. But it's worth noting that this is the first ever recorded tornado in August in Knox County. Of course, we do get tornadoes in East Tennessee sometimes. They typically are in the spring. That's the most common time as you're getting the change of seasons. And again, there's a sort of smaller window of tornado season often in the fall, again with the change of seasons, because it's when you get those real differentials in temperature and so forth with the
volatility in the atmosphere.
Right. Typically in the summer, because of where the jet stream moves farther north in the summer, and we typically don't get that level of volatility. And, this is one of these things. Of course, we've had a lot of weather events across the country and across the world, actually, this summer. The heat dome effect in Texas and the Southwest, which we have mostly been spared. Actually, our summer temperature-wise in East Tennessee has kind of been more or less normal, maybe on the warmer side, but not too far out of historic norms. But that's not true elsewhere in the country. And I think the thing that's always tricky for reporters talking about these things, and I've seen essays written about this, is, of course, we report on the weather events themselves as they happen, but it can be hard to tie those into sort of like the bigger narrative of what's going on with our climate. And we all know that, basically every kind of severe weather is among the projected likely outcomes of climate change according to various models, precisely because we're going to, it projects more volatility, higher highs, lower lows, those kinds of things. But it's hard, which is, really kind of impossible to pinpoint any one incident and say, oh, this is because, this is because of climate change. This is because of warming in the atmosphere. Nevertheless, when you see a sequence of unusual things like the hottest month in recorded world history, followed by the next hottest month in recorded world history, followed by something like, say, the first ever tornado in August in Knox County, when you're getting a lot of firsts and a lot of mosts and so forth all in a row, it's hard not to think that, we are pattern-seeking creatures, and especially we in the media are pattern-seeking creatures. It's hard not to look at this and say, well, maybe something's going on.
Yeah, for years. In fact, for several years in the early 2000s, I was the environmental reporter at the News Sentinel, and that was when the News Sentinel first started really looking at global warming and that sort of thing. In fact, I think I wrote the first local story that would really looked at that, and even from the beginning, there was always the caution, well, you can't say any particular weather event is directly connected to climate change, but overall, it's like the example that is real easy is hurricanes. Mm-hmm. Well, they talk about that hurricanes will be, there'll be more storms, they'll be more intense. Well, so you can't say any one particular hurricane is a global warming hurricane, because we get them every year. But if elevated numbers, yes, and then of course, and that's one of those things that can be used either way by climate, people who don't believe that climate change is actually happening, because say, well, we haven't had no damaging tornado last year or whatever. Well, just because hurricane. Just because a hurricane doesn't make landfall doesn't mean there weren't more hurricanes. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's a lot of hurricanes dissipate out in the open ocean. So
and that's the complicated thing.
But
with
it's
the weather.
Very complicated.
There's so many variables and factors, and it's a lot of them are short term. And so, when you're looking at longer term patterns, how that feeds into short term patterns and actual events and everything, right? It is difficult. But I think one thing it means is that we all need to be prepared for unusual weather, and hopefully we've gotten that message, because we've had, over the last 10 years, let's say, we've had a lot of historically unusual weather. And I think among the other things it means is, when you hear that there's a severe storm warning, say, it's important to pay attention to how severe they're talking about, because, it can be easy to say, well, it's summer, we get thunderstorms in the afternoons, everybody knows this, I'm just going to go ahead and go to the grocery store or whatever. You might want to double check that alert a little more carefully, because, for example, this past Monday storm was not one that you wanted to be out in unless you had no other choice. It was a good time to stay home, basically.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's one of those things where we get enough thunderstorm warnings and things like that, and it is easy to dismiss them, because most of the time they're bad thunderstorms, or it's not, every now and then there's some hail, it's not, but in this case it was, I think that the warnings came out close to the time that they hit, that no, this is going to be a doozy.
Well, and they did not get out a tornado. There were severe storm alerts, but they did not get out a tornado warning in a timely fashion, which the National Weather Service had to come back and apologize for, essentially, because they do try to let people know that, obviously. But I think that also speaks to, when you get a strong storm moving, it can be hard, even for the professionals, even for people who are watching it in real time, to really try to anticipate what's going to happen in the next hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, and so forth.
Oh yeah, it's as much as that we want certainty. It's not. Yeah. So things can happen, and even so, I mean, where I live, there were high winds and torrential rain, but nothing like what happened in West Knoxville,
Right.
and that's just a few miles away.
Yep. Well, I think everybody just stay safe out there, and pay attention to those weather alerts.
Yeah.
Okay, maybe turning to something a little bit less tempestuous, the Knoxville mayor's race. There was a forum, as we talked about last week, featuring the 4 mayoral candidates, and then this week, Scott, you wrote long profiles of incumbent mayor India Kincannon and then her 3 challengers. You want to just kind of let's just talk a little bit about who those challengers are and kind of the state of the race right now.
Yeah, for all 4 of them, Mayor Kincannon is running on her record, and so that's what you expect incumbents to do. So I think most people are who are going to be voting are familiar with her record and will react accordingly. The 3 challengers, and one thing that's kind of odd is most of the time when there's an incumbent mayor running for re-election, there's very little opposition, and it's very. In fact, I look back in recent history, the mayors have. The incumbent mayors have won re-election in the primary without having to go on to the general election. That means they got more than half the vote in the primary. So it's very difficult for challengers to unseat a sitting mayor. But we've got 3 who are working on it. There's a mortgage banker named Jeff Tallman, business owner R.C. Lawhorn, and social justice activist Constance Every. We profiled all 3 of them. Of the 3, Tallman is one who's probably been the most engaged over the longest period of time. He was involved with 9 Counties 1 Vision. He was been a neighborhood association president, things like that. He's one of these people who's been active civically but not electorally as far as running for office, and decided to run this time around. He's of the 3 challengers probably has the best kind of in general grasp of what's going on or how city government works. He's very boosterish of Knoxville. He is, and it calls himself kind of a regionalist too. That Knoxville isn't an island. It's got to work with the county. It's got to work with the state. It's got to work with the other counties surrounding Knoxville in order to address a lot of the issues. So he's probably a little bit more conservative. He is more conservative than just about anybody else in the field.
He's kind of the undeclared Republican. I don't think he's come out and said he's a Republican, but he's been speaking to local Republican organizations, for example, kind of presenting himself as more the business-friendly candidate in the race.
And he talks, and he has thrown around phrase left-wing
as a negative,
as a negative, and you don't hear people who are Democrats doing that. But it's a nonpartisan race. He's not, running on a partisan basis. One thing that does kind of separate him is that as almost all the other candidates have talked about how. The intersection of race and law enforcement and city government and those things. Tallman is very much a we need to move on and be a colorblind city. Doesn't and I won't say disparagingly talks about, but he's not real keen on specific programs that are specifically addressed specifically done on a racial basis.
Right, kind of the idea that it's inherently divisive to talk about and focus on race, and it's better to look at the big picture.
Or with it's one of those things where we need to address poverty. If we address poverty, by extension, it's going to address race,
right,
and things like that. But and says that stands in opposition to the way Kincannon looks at things. But Tallman is running. He's raised a little bit more money than the other challengers. None of them come close to Kincannon's fundraising unless they really cranked it up in the last few weeks. The last disclosure came out on, the disclosure period was through June 30th. At that time, Kincannon had $25 for every dollar that the other three had combined.
Right.
So that's,
and we're going to get the latest reports next week on that, right?
Yeah, there will be a pre-primary report that comes out before Election Day, and then but R.C. Lawhorn is running. Lawhorn, if that name kind of rings a bell a little bit, was the owner of Billiards and Brews. It's a bar and pool hall essentially in West Knoxville. He ran afoul of the law in staying open beyond the curfew that was imposed during COVID-19. The police cited him multiple times and wound up losing his beer license and his state liquor license. Then continued doing business selling liquor and got indicted for that eventually, and he sold the business, but he still got the legal issues with the state over he was selling beer without, or selling liquor and wine without a license, and storing it on his premises. So,
although he says that's not why he's running, right?
Well, it's funny. I first asked him the first time I talked to him, I asked him if that and he kind of downplayed that. And then when I sat down for a more extensive interview for this profile, I asked him why he's running, and then that's all he talked about.
Uh-huh.
So it was.
So it is at least part of why he's.
It is definitely part of the motivation.
Yeah.
He's kind of an interesting guy. He's born and raised in Knoxville, has the accent to prove it, which I get to say because I have one too. He's very pragmatic. He also has a contracting he's got three businesses. He's got a contracting business, a general contracting business, a couple other contracting related businesses. Very pragmatic in some ways, but there's some and he's got some ideas that are different than a lot that have come up. The biggest one is he would like to see the city go back into the school business. He wants he would like to see the city reinstate a K through 12 school system the way it was before the late 1980s, when the city went out of the school business and everything merged into Knox County schools. Of course, it's a very expensive and difficult, complex thing that if he goes on to the general election, we'll have to delve into a little bit more about how exactly he thinks that would work. That's one thing. Another is the way that he would address homelessness. He wants to build a large single campus, essentially he said big shelter, but I think it's more of a campus somewhere. Didn't say where, but to have all homelessness services there, and thinks that would draw the homeless population out of camping in neighborhoods and parks and things like that, and bring them into one location. Of course, one of the things is there is kind of a private nonprofit sector default campus now. I mean, people talk about the Mission District on Fifth Avenue.
Broadway, between the interstate and Fifth Avenue.
Yeah, and so there's kind of already a that's where most of the, not all, but most of the direct services are located, and so.
Well, and that was something when he mentioned that at the mayoral forum. That was the first thing I thought, because you and I have both covered ongoing struggles over homeless services and providers over the years, and even locating a small, permanent supportive housing complex anywhere in a neighborhood or really anywhere at all can be very contentious. It's something that local residents tend to resist fiercely. And so that was the first thing I thought was, where exactly are you envisioning this giant campus going?
Yeah,
because I can't think of any place in the county where you could propose it and not immediately run into a lot of questions and probably opposition from people.
Yeah, like I said, if he moves on from the primary to the general election, then that will definitely be more to explore on exactly how he thinks that would work. The other candidate is Constance Every. She's for those who go to city council meetings or watch them on CTV, she's a regular there as far as speaking at public forums. She's a harsh critic of Mayor Kincannon.
Has literally accused her of crimes.
Yes, she has accused her of crimes. I don't want to repeat what those crimes were because there's no evidence.
There's no factual basis for these accusations.
But I think that most of the time you could take those metaphorically, but I don't know how serious she is about it. One of the reasons I don't know how serious she is about it is because she did not agree to sit down with an interview.
Right. She got upset about something factual that you reported just a month or two ago. Actually, just re-reporting something that had been reported by WBIR, but she was not happy about that and refused to talk. And we've talked about this on the podcast before. Of course, we always prefer that people agree to talk. The thing I think people sometimes don't understand is in some ways they make our lives easier when they refuse to talk, because then we can just use, the existing record, which you did. I mean, you wrote a profile of her. She has a pretty extensive track record of public engagement and so forth. So when people decline to talk to us, all they're really doing is kind of giving up their own opportunity to present their own narrative to us, because we are still going to write about them.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things is when I say that she speaks at city council and she's a vocal critic, she's a real vocal critic. She got arrested for disrupting a city council meeting and for disrupting a county commission meeting. Those are still those still haven't been resolved completely. That she's still got court dates upcoming on those, or a court date upcoming on both of those charges. She's disrupted. She's the bullhorn at a public gathering in support of the community when Austin East High School students had been a series of shootings involving Austin East students as victims. Things like that. She's a very, I think it's completely fair to say that she's very angry. A lot of it has to do with she's against the stadium in part because it occupies area that it was hit by urban renewal, and she's African American. She's very angry about that. I think it's very fair to say that she's angry. One of the things I wanted to ask her is explain to readers, the source of the anger. I mean, you can guess the source of the anger, but I wanted to hear her say, okay, this is why I'm angry. Mm-hmm. This is why you should be angry, or whatever. Get more of an explanation for it. And unfortunately, she didn't. She won't have that opportunity to our readers are follow things. They know what's going on and want to know what's going on and would want to know more about that. Another aspect is she is quite vocal about homelessness and affordable housing. One thing is she has said publicly that she was homeless herself for 4 years after she was discharged from the military. And I would have loved to have said, tell me about that experience and how that has shaped your thoughts on what we should do about homelessness and housing. She didn't have that opportunity because she hasn't said anything like that at city council meetings when she basically gives a stump speech during public forum and things like that. So, it was a missed opportunity, I think, for her. We were able to go ahead. Like I said, you said put together things from the public, things that she said at city council and other places. Also had to go into her record. I mean, as I said, she was arrested twice for disrupting meetings. She was also arrested and recently convicted of simple assault in an incident that occurred at NAMA in downtown Knoxville. She got into a confrontation with employees there and wound up being charged with assault and convicted. So those are, that's all part of the record, and that's all in the profile, the three profiles of the challengers, the profile of the mayor. Those are all bound together. In fact, go ahead and say this to anyone listening. We're a subscription website, but our election coverage is now that we've done so far is out from behind the paywall. You can go to CompassKnox.com and read those profiles and other election coverage. We also covered the recent city council candidate forum. We've covered the mayoral forum, other reports that we've done this summer on the race. You can just go to CompassKnox.com and read all those for free and share them with anyone you think they would benefit. And we think that it would be a valuable thing to learn because we did it. No.
Right. You can go and read all of those on our website. And so early voting is underway. It began last Wednesday the 9th, and it runs through Thursday the 24th, ahead of the actual primary election day, which is Tuesday, August 29th. And we only have a couple days worth of early voting statistics so far, but it's safe to say that we are not exactly off to a roaring start in terms of turnout.
No, in the first 2 days of early voting, 1,251 people have voted. Now that includes 421 absentee ballots. So only 840 people have actually voted at one of the 6 early voting locations in person. That's 1.2% of the electorate. There are about 103,000 registered voters in the city of Knoxville. You can't people who register now, it's too late to vote in this election, so that number's not going to change. If you projected this out over the course of early voting, early voting's 14 days, 650 a day voting, you're going to get about 8, and this includes the absentee ballots, which a lot of those are already in.
Right.
Those kind of tend to,
a few more will trickle in.
They dissipate over time because people are voting absentee because they know they're going to be voting absentee, and they do it early on. But it's going to be less than 10,000.
Which is typical for these city primaries, and especially these years where we have a lot of incumbents running. That often tends, although we'll see overall, because the years where incumbents are running, a lot of times we have had uncontested races, and this year we do not, except for in the 5th district. Charles Thomas doesn't have an opponent as he seeks re-election, but all of the rest of the seats are actually contested, and so I guess we'll see if we actually get more turnout because there's somewhat more interest. But overall, we expect this to be a low turnout election, and so far that looks like what we're going to get.
As Chris Davis, the administrator of elections, has said, I think we were talking about this last week. It's been decades since more than 30,000 people have voted in a city election.
Yeah,
and
I thought the interesting post that the election commission pushed out was that the last 5 or 6 election cycles and stuff like that, and as our population grows, the numbers are still dropping. Which I thought was probably the most upsetting. Might not be the right word, but not great stats of watching these cycles.
Right. If you go back to the 1970s, he had stats for one particular contested mayoral race where there were actually 50,000 city voters. Yeah. We haven't had anything close to 50,000 city voters.
No, that's true. That's
a contested or uncontested
yeah.
Race since. So. Right, and in fact, the population of the city is probably it's about 30,000 or so more than it was in the mid 70s. So,
if you're listening to this, you are registered to vote. You know people who are registered to vote in the city, not in the county, but in the city. Go. You got 6 early voting locations. You can find them at knoxvotes.org. That's the Election Commission's website. If you need to catch up on things, it's got a sample ballot and all kinds of election information, but you can find out where you can go and vote early and go vote. I mean, come on. It's one of the things that we get to actually cheer for as journalists and not feel like we are biased one way or another. I mean, yeah, I am biased for elections and proudly so. And I think that people ought to get out and vote, and you've got a great opportunity. You got 2 weeks to vote early, and then you've got the election day on the 29th. So I have no illusions that we're going to get anywhere close to 50,000 voters, but hopefully as many people as who can will get out and vote.
And if you want to vote in the mayor's race and the municipal judge race in particular, both of those are races that could be decided in the primary. If any candidate gets more than 50% of the vote in the primary for the mayor and judge positions, they win outright. And so if you're thinking, I'll wait to vote until the general election once, the primary voters have sorted things out, you may be too late in a couple of cases if you do that. So definitely, if you want to make your voice heard, now is the time to do it. And next week we will check in and see how those early voting stats are looking and if they've ticked up at all. I wanted to talk about this really interesting report on special education services that came to the school board this week. And of course, this has been, it's been a long running issue in Knox County. I've been covering public education in Knox County on and off. There were whole periods where I wasn't, but on and off since the mid-1990s, so almost 30 years. And in that entire time, there has been a consistent refrain from advocates for students with disabilities, advocates for special education services, saying that Knox County schools basically is very difficult to deal with, particularly for students with more severe disabilities who need, something beyond a little bit of extra time on a test or whatever, people who really kind of need the ongoing hands-on services day to day, that it's just been very hard to get the school system to agree to provide those services. Long history of lawsuits being filed against the school system over this, and a long history of the school system tending to lose those lawsuits. And this is something that special education advocates have been saying for years, is that, if the school system was more proactive and responsive to parents' concerns and requests on the front end, they wouldn't end up in so much litigation and have to pay out so many settlements, which they do and have. So that's been kind of the set dynamic through multiple superintendents, multiple school boards. The interesting thing that's happened here is new superintendent John Ryswick, who of course just took over last year, promised in coming in that he was really going to do a comprehensive review of district operations kind of across the board. And so his various administrators who are in charge of different parts of the school system operation, he has charged them with taking a serious look at everything that they're doing and bring back any recommendations or reforms or whatever. And on special education in particular, he committed and then did to appoint a task force, which he did this past spring. It's an interesting task force because it's a 10-person task force, and 9 of them are parents, and then 1 special education teacher. So not at all loaded up with sort of like school system people, very much wanting to hear from the users of the system, the parents. And this task force spent the summer reviewing survey data, doing focus groups, and also looking at kind of like best practices, getting input from a lot of places. And the report that they presented to the school board at their work session this past Monday is pretty damning. I mean, for a group that was appointed by the superintendent, it was pretty much, no punches pulled kind of report that basically said there is a deep-seated cultural problem with the way the school system addresses special education, and specifically identified that problem as arising from really two places. And kind of they made 5 specific recommendations, and that report is up on our website. You can read it there. But really the gist of what they're saying is that they feel like special education teachers mostly want to kind of quote unquote do the right thing and provide services to students and work with families, and that even school level administration, principals and so forth are more amenable to that. But where they see obstacles coming is from central office, and that there has been a sort of philosophical and or knee-jerk opposition to providing extensive, more exceptional kinds of services to students who need extra kinds of help. And there's a lot of different points of contention, but the biggest single point of contention is where those students actually get placed within the school. There's a federal special education law going back to the 1970s that requires school systems to provide what it calls the least restrictive environment for students, which mostly means that students should be in regular education classrooms as much as possible. A general idea, a philosophical orientation toward having students in the classroom with the belief, which is based on a lot of data, that students with disabilities perform better, learn more, not just academically, but also socially when they are in a regular classroom setting than when they are pulled out and kind of placed into a classroom with nothing but other students with sometimes very severe kinds of disabilities. And that's often where the tension is between parents wanting their kids to be in a classroom and the school system feeling like it's going to be hard to have that kid in the classroom. They can be disruptive, that, that basically you're going to need a lot of extra resources to make that happen. And so there's been a tendency, this report says, and this is again something parents have been saying for a long time, to take was maybe the easier path for the school system and say, well, we're just going to move that kid over into this other special classroom, and that way we don't have to worry about how you manage them in a general classroom setting. And so, and then the other sort of actor that this report identified is the Knox County Law Department, which of course, when the school system does get sued, the law department is the one who defends these cases. And advocates, again, have said for a long time that they think the county law department is kind of needlessly adversarial in how they approach that they seem to tend to assume that basically every complaint is meritless and that we're just going to deny all of these and we're going to defend them in court. And if they lose at the first level of court, then they'll appeal it. And if they lose again, they'll appeal it again. We just had that happen this year with a case we talked about on the podcast a few months ago with a student with autism who the school system placed in a special education classroom. The parents wanted them in a general setting. And basically the parents appealed this, and at every single level that the parents appealed it, starting with administrative hearings and then moving on into court cases and then, appeals eventually up to the Sixth Circuit, the federal Sixth Circuit, at every single level, the school system lost. At every single level, the judge or administrative hearing officer, or whoever looked at the case, said, yes, you should provide these, you should do what the parents want. And instead of taking that for an answer, the law department just appealed it and appealed it and appealed it. And, so we're now like 3 or 4 years, I think, into this lawsuit where finally the Sixth Circuit, and they have not yet indicated that they're going to appeal it to the Supreme Court. I think they may finally accept the ruling of the Sixth Circuit, having lost like 4 times, at this point. And so, the task force said that, as other parents have said for a long time, that they think it would be better for somebody other than the Knox County Law Department with, specific expertise in special education law to look at these cases on the front end and help the school system and say, like you're probably going, like if this goes to court, you're probably going to lose it. And, the actual cost of providing whatever this thing is that the parents are asking for is probably going to be less than if you go through a whole court case and then still have to do it and pay their attorney's fees and everything. And also that it's kind of like, quote unquote, the right thing to do. It's what federal law says you're supposed to be doing anyway. And so they are recommending that the school system engage on an ongoing basis with some outside legal counsel to review these things, and that the law department, of course, the law department represents all offices in the county. If there is a lawsuit that goes to court, they are still probably going to be the ones defending it, but that there might be a way to head off a lot of those cases if you have somebody else review those on the front end before it gets to that point. The law department typically is pretty protective of its turf. The only statement they made about this was they said there were factual inaccuracies in the report, although they didn't identify any factual inaccuracies. Yeah. They just said there were, but they said they would talk to the school board about it. And kind of the thing is, if the school board does want to engage with outside counsel, they have to get permission to do that under the county charter, either from the law department or from county commission. Mm-hmm. So we'll see how all that shakes out. But interestingly, this report was presented on Monday, and a lot of the members of the task force and then parents of students with special education who have kind of been following this all kind of said, yes, this is great. This report says exactly this reflects our experiences. Mm-hmm. We agree with this report's recommendations, but the concern was, what happens now? The task force has submitted its report. Ryswick was somewhat non-committal at Monday's meeting about it, kind of saying, well, certainly it would inform the way the school system, they're conducting their own internal review as well, but that this would certainly inform how they move forward. But then at Thursday's board meeting, the regular voting meeting, board vice chair Betsy Henderson, who has kind of positioned herself as the strongest parents' rights advocate on the school board, she said that she's going to bring a resolution. She, first of all, said she very much supported the work of the task force and thanked them for their recommendations. She's going to bring a recommendation next month to formally adopt the recommendations of the task force, which would mean that, it would go from being sort of advisory to saying that, yes, this is what we actually want the administration to do, which would be a pretty major change and shift in how the school system addresses this issue. It's a lot of kids who are affected by this. There's a little under 20% of the student population that has identified special education needs of one kind or another. So anyway, a pretty interesting and unusually damning report for a committee that was actually appointed by the superintendent.
Yeah, the one thing on the not on the lawsuit end, but on the classroom end, I'm very familiar with one case or incident, or not incident, one case that a student had very on the spectrum of disabilities, a very very light disability, and the school system, the school where this student went, made sure they were in a special classroom, mm-hmm. which this child was in no way, really needed to be in a special classroom. Could have easily been in a regular classroom, but they did that. Now, so I mean that kind of not resonates, but it kind of backs up that anecdotal
right
experience that I know of.
Well, and that's the thing is that, and we talked in our article about this with Kim Kredich, who has been sort of the leading parent advocate for students with disabilities for about the last 15 years here, as her own son with autism was working through the school system. He's actually out of the school system now, and she's kind of formally retiring from her volunteer position as that leading parent advocate. But she said that what she was really happy to see with this report is that that's what we've had to date, is just a constant accumulation of anecdotes.
Yeah.
One parent after another saying this has been their experience. And what this report did was kind of take all of that anecdotal evidence that everybody's been hearing for years and saying, this is real and it's systemic. It's not a case-by-case thing. It really reflects undergoing or underlying kind of philosophical orientations at the school system level, and that's where it needs to be addressed, and that's what it's calling for. So certainly more to come on all that, and we'll be tracking it, but pretty interesting development. Another interesting story that we wrote this week, and Scott, I know this is one that you worked on for weeks, because this was kind of a tip that we had heard that you and our friends at Blank Newspaper had kind of been pursuing. But we had a visitation here in Knoxville from the Muppets. What happened?
Yeah, this was some real investigative reporting, and it was kind of fun investigative reporting, actually. Back in April, the Muppets snuck into Knoxville. This was something that was kept under wraps, and our friends at Blank got a tip that this had occurred and contacted us, and we decided to work together on it. And what happened was that, and I won't go through all the long, convoluted things that we did to get this story out, but the Sesame Street ended up recording 3 specials that are going to be airing this fall. One of them just started streaming in Knoxville at River Media Studios. That's a local television production company with ties to HGTV, and they tape these programs at Beaumont Magnet Academy, at Central High School, Young Williams Animal Center, and the Bark, which is a indoor dog park in North Knoxville. And so they tape these specials here, and it was kind of we thought it was kind of a big deal because Sesame Street's an iconic TV program, and we wanted to share the good news that I think most people would think that it's good news that a high profile television production went on here. It gave work to a local company and involved Knox County school students and all, but it's funny. Sesame Street's real secretive about what they're doing, and they wouldn't talk about it. They had confidentiality agreements with everybody here. They wouldn't talk about it. It's kind of one of these things that there were a lot of people who knew it happened, but none who could go on the record and directly talk about it. But we eventually pulled out the story. The 3 specials, one. And this was kind of a departure for Sesame Street, because they're doing unscripted shows, and they're using their synergy with HBO Max, or it used to be HBO Max, just Max now. They're the streaming service now that's picked up Sesame Street. They're owned by Warner Brothers Discovery, which used to have, they own HGTV and Food Network, which were headquartered here at one time. The River Media did work with them and does work with them on HGTV and Food Network programming. So, all that synergy, as they like to say in the corporate world, work together to get these specials recorded here. The one is a bake sale that Cookie Monster puts on at Beaumont, and some taping at Central as well. It is a one of those food competition things that did with Eddie Jackson of the Food Network was the human host, and so that involved all a lot of students from Beaumont, and then the next one's going to be Oscar the Grouch working with Oscar was working with Sonny Anderson. So it's kind of funny. Oscar the Grouch and Sonny Anderson, who's also a Food Network personality, and they put on a costume animal or dog parade. This is a Halloween thing. So it's combines the animals from Young Williams Animal Center with the costumes of Halloween. They make costumes from Oscar's treasure trove of garbage, and the dogs wear those, and it's supposed to be a lot of fun. I haven't seen anything on it, but it involved not only Young Williams Animal Center, but the bark, the people there, and then the third's a Christmas special with Elmo and Tango. They're involved in a makeover of a classroom at Beaumont, and so that's more of an HGTV thing. Jasmine Roth, who is an HGTV host, was the human guest on that. But it was kind of interesting that they were doing all these things here, and nobody talked about it. That was the thing.
Right. There was a press release that came out that announced these specials coming up, but it didn't say in it anywhere specifically that these were filmed in Knoxville or anything like that.
Well, that came at the last minute.
Right.
We had tried to get the folks at River Media, or actually the folks at Sesame Street to talk. Contacted them. They didn't even respond. Folks at River Media wanted to talk, but they had a confidentiality agreement with Sesame Workshop, which is the nonprofit that owns Sesame Street. Sesame Workshop wouldn't let them out of their confidentiality agreement. They knew we were going to be doing a story, but they wouldn't let them out of it. The school system is kind of interesting. They had a contract to work with. Between River Media and the school system to do the filming at Central and at Beaumont. And it was kind of interesting. The contract had a code name. See, really, it was uncontroversial because there wasn't any money changing hands or anything. Kind of slipped through back in April. It had a confidentiality agreement, so the school system couldn't comment on it. So we didn't get to. There were a lot of people we couldn't talk to at the very last minute. After I finally sent between River Media kind of bugging Sesame Workshop, I finally sent an email to Sesame Workshop saying, "Hey, I've been asking about this forever. We're running this story, and in fact, a story in Hollywood Reporter had already come out of." Sesame Street's got these new specials coming out. They didn't want Knoxville, but they did that. So finally, they sent a press release and some photos and a link to a promo video. Sent that at kind of the last minute. We did get the good folks at Young Williams talked about their experience with it. I don't know. I mean, they sounded like a lot of fun with them. We did get firsthand contributions from people who actually were involved in the taping, but unfortunately we didn't get a whole lot from River Media. Didn't get a whole lot from the school system. But it's kind of interesting, that whole idea that these connections between Knoxville that were created when HGTV was headquartered here, even though Warner Brothers Discovery has shut down. They're not completely shut down, but they sold their high-profile campus, and obviously a lot of work has gone elsewhere within that corporation. That those connections still have an effect, and it was really kind of interesting because Sesame Street since 1993 has been recorded at the same studios in Queens in New York, historic studio that used to be the old original Paramount studio back in the silent movie days, so this was a departure for them to go away from there, and so it remains to be seen if they're going to do future episodes here or future specials. Like I said, these are specials. They're not the regular seasonal or season program, the day-to-day season programming, which will start sometime this fall. But these are the Cookie Monster's base sale episode is already up on
I
Max,
actually
so
had
you
it
could-
promoted to me by Max yesterday when I tuned into
Oh,
when I
really?
turned on my TV. You go to Max and it kind of shows you whatever's new or whatever, and that was at the top of the screen.
I've not done that yet. I do have Max, but I don't haven't done that yet. Of course, I've seen the trailer, so I don't need to do that. But and don't have any kids at home who really want to watch Sesame Street. But I'll watch it at some point and see what all the hubbub is about. But just it was just very interesting. It was for a feature story, kind of a good news.
Right.
Feature story.
As I
This
said
was-
at one point, it's not like we're trying. This isn't an expose. We didn't catch Oscar drunk on Market Square or anything like that.
But really, you would think that in dealing with this, it would be kind of like I was thinking that a lot of the time, this isn't the Manhattan Project. This is Sesame Street. This is a good thing. But I guess Sesame Workshop had its reasons to keep things quiet. I could understand them not wanting the content of the shows out until they were ready, and lo and behold, it wasn't. And but of course, our interest was more in the experience of the local folks working with the Muppets and the whole Sesame Street experience. And I know for one thing, you assume that just by looking at the trailer, the kids had a lot of fun working with them, doing stuff with the Muppets. The Young Williams folks said that the dogs loved it and were not freaked out at all by having a large furry puppet pet them. And those were the kinds of things that we were interested in, and got a little flavor of it in the story, and hopefully, the kids and Young Williams all benefit from this exposure. So.
Right. And you can read that story both on our website and also at Blank Newspaper, because this was a joint effort with them. And two things that strike me about it. One is just the difficulty that this shows for local media, and this has been true for a long time, in dealing with national, multinational corporations. It can just be very hard to even get their attention. They're these sort of
Yes.
like giants, and we're these tiny little entities trying to get their attention. They don't necessarily see a lot of upside in working with or even acknowledging us. My favorite personal experience with that was years ago when I was a reporter in Sevierville for the Mountain Press. Shout out Mountain Press. Going to a local planning commission meeting where the plans for a new Walmart store were unveiled very specifically. Like saw the map, saw the store. It said Walmart on it. The guys making the presentation kept saying Walmart, Walmart, Walmart. I was like, oh, well, that's interesting. So I go back to the office and I tried to get in touch with Walmart, did eventually reach somebody in, Walmart public relations. And I said, yeah, what can you tell me about the new store in Sevierville, Tennessee? And she said, we haven't announced any store in Sevierville, any new store in Sevierville. And I said, well, you might not have announced it, but I was literally just at this meeting where like I've seen the plans. I know how big the parking lot is. It says Walmart right on. I have a photo. What can you tell me about it? And she just said, we haven't announced any. And I was like, okay. So I wrote the story without any comment from Walmart because they didn't care what the local newspaper was going to write about them. They were going to put out their press release when they were going to put out their press release. And that was that.
Yeah.
But the other thing I think about this that's interesting is there has been a lot of question about what would be the local impacts of the changes that we've seen in video, in our video production landscape here, particularly with the old Scripps Networks being bought by Discovery back in I think 2018 was when that purchase.
And they closed down operations last year at the at their campus and put it up for sale. The sale closed. It's now owned by a bank,
right?
And it closed in March, I believe.
And they do still have local offices. They have a local presence, but obviously reduced. And there has just been a lot of uncertainty about what does that mean, because we have a whole sort of local ecosystem that had grown up around Scripps Network, including River Media, but also places like Jupiter Entertainment. This, for a while, Knoxville has been a fairly significant TV production center, and there is still a lot of work going on here. And I think one thing that's interesting about this is it kind of suggests a bit of a path forward there where, right, we may not, I mean, we're not going to be a headquarters anymore like we were when Scripps was based here. But we can still, because there is such an accumulated base of expertise here, we can still be a place that Discovery can use sort of strategically to, we'll produce that in Knoxville, and it makes sense to use our HGTV people there and so forth. So, as you said, these are just specials. It doesn't necessarily indicate any long-term or ongoing commitment to production in Knoxville, but it suggests that at least that there may be some.
Yeah, if Sesame Street does future specials, new specials in the coming years, they may look here because of that those corporate connections. I mean, one of the things, one of the big connections is that River Media was founded by Dee Haslam, who's the daughter of Ross Bagwell Jr., who founded the production company Cinetel that Scripps bought to start HGTV. Right. So there's all, and the leadership. The
roots go deep.
Yeah, the leadership at River Media. Lori Golden Stryer is the CEO. Worked at HGTV when it was headquartered here. Bob Baskerville's the president of the studios there. He was a co-founder of HGTV, so there are all these connections, and even with Young Williams, because the CEO of Young Williams is Janet Testerman, who before she became CEO of Young Williams was an executive at Scripps Networks Interactive, which was the corporate parent of HGTV at that time.
Yeah. So it
lots
is
of connections.
It's interesting to see that lineage still kind of continuing. All right, why don't we take a quick break here, and we will come back and do our reader Q&A. Okay, now we are to the Q&A portion of the podcast. Every week we go onto our subscriber-only Facebook group, the Compass Colloquy, which you can join if you're a Compass subscriber. And if you are not a Compass subscriber, you can become one at CompassKnox.com. Anyway, we go onto that Facebook group and we just ask folks if there's anything in particular they would like to hear about beyond, that week's headlines. And we got a couple of questions this week, and one that was raised, which is kind of a persistent question, persistent topic of conversation, has to do with the closure of Lakeshore Mental Health Institute back in 2011 and 12, and kind of what was supposed to happen at that point to the state resources that were going into Lakeshore to provide services to people with mental health issues. And kind of what has happened. And we've talked about this a little bit here before, but there's kind of a narrative you will hear from people out there, especially when they're talking about homelessness, say in Knoxville, or mental health needs in Knoxville. There's this narrative that, everything kind of got worse when Lakeshore closed. And, on the one hand, that's true kind of chronologically, as the most recent homelessness reports in Knoxville have shown. We have had an increase in numbers of homeless people here, but it's very hard to go back and tie that to any one incident. In fact, there was not a big jump in recorded homelessness in the years right after Lakeshore closed here locally, because those are not actually identical population. I think there's a tendency to kind of think, kind of everybody who's homeless or who I see like camping under a bridge or whatever, those are people who might have been in Lakeshore in the past. That's not really true. Those are not there. Yes, there's overlap for sure. Yeah. A lot of people experiencing homelessness do also have mental health issues, but it's certainly not true that everybody who's homeless has mental health needs, or that everybody with mental health needs is homeless. They're different populations.
Or that everyone who had been a patient at Lakeshore automatically became homeless.
Right. So. But to the question, what the state said at the time was that they would provide equivalent resources that would go into other existing, say, private hospitals, and we do have some private mental health hospitals here and toward other community-based services and so forth. And so this came up at that joint meeting earlier this month that the City Council and County Commission had talking about mental health services. It also came up at the similar meeting they had the previous year where they talked about this. And at both meetings, there were representatives there from the State Department of Mental Health and Substance Abuse Services pushing back on the idea that the state had sort of walked away from mental health services in East Tennessee when Lakeshore closed. And the numbers that they presented at this most recent meeting, they said that the last year that Lakeshore was in operation, total state funding for mental health services in East Tennessee was about $8.8 million. And that I think that year there were about 2,200 admissions to Lakeshore the last year that it was open. And that this current year, the state funding for mental health services in East Tennessee, which again goes to those private hospitals, it also pays for services at Moccasin Bend Mental Health Institute, State Institute down in Chattanooga, where a couple hundred people a year are transported to from here for services there. Anyway, total state funding now is $55.2 million. So really significant increase in funding in that time. And also that they're actually serving more people, that between all of the different inpatient places that are available this past year, there were 2,800 people who were admitted to those various hospitals. So basically, what has happened is that the state has continued to provide resources and is providing more resources now, and in fact, serving more people. That doesn't, of course, there is a push on County Commission. They passed a resolution last fall, and they've been making a push to have the state reopen some kind of long-term inpatient center here, probably a smaller kind of center than Lakeshore was. So there is still a push here to have that particular kind of resource available. But basically, the state is spending a lot of money on mental health services in East Tennessee, and in fact is serving more people than it did. Of course, we've had population growth since then too, but they are serving more people than they did when Lakeshore was open.
Yeah, and one thing that people may not be aware of, and we reported on, it's been reported by other media too, 2 private mental health hospitals have opened just in the last year or so.
Yeah.
So, I mean, they don't serve the entire population, and they
right. Those are places where you're probably going to need to have insurance.
Probably have insurance to go. There's not. No one is pretending that should serve. All the needs. But it's 2 hospitals that serve that serve a lot of people. Plus, of course, it's not a long term thing, but the joint city county mental health facility that's going to be at the public safety complex at the former St. Mary's Hospital site is going to add to the services that are available. And I think one of the things here is Lakeshore was more than a mental hospital. It was a symbol. I think that it was a symbol of a commitment to providing mental health services, and when it was gone, I think in a lot of people's minds that meant the state had abandoned mental health services in East Tennessee, and there really doesn't seem to be a very easy place where you can say, okay, anybody with mental health issues goes here and then gets their services elsewhere. There's no real clearinghouse for information or anything like that. And I think that people see that as being that the services aren't available. And it takes a lot of work to find those services.
Right.
But I think that as anyone who's familiar with the operation of state mental hospitals in history will know that Lakeshore, Lakeshore being open wasn't exactly the golden era of mental health care, although it got a lot better toward the end before they shut down. And I think more than more than anything, it was a symbol of the state's commitment.
Yeah, and it was something that people who live here could kind of, if you saw somebody who you thought was in crisis or maybe needed help or whatever, as a member of the public, you could kind of feel some sense that, well, they can go to Lakeshore. Like there's a place for them to go, right? You have that as a citizen who sees a problem and you want to know that there's some resource available for it. You kind of had that sense, well, at least we have that. And so, right, with Lakeshore gone, your average person doesn't necessarily know that, there's Peninsula, which is a private institution that does accept people who are paid for by state funding, for example. Yeah. But most people may not be aware of it, or that we do have a couple hundred people a year who are sent down to Moccasin Bend, for example. So right, it's not a place that people can see. But and we talked about this last week in our discussion of that work session, where all of there was kind of a rundown of all of the different efforts and resources and everything that's out there. It is not the case that there aren't resources, and it's not the case that there's not state funding. It is the case that everybody seems to agree that it is the case that there is still more need than there are resources for. So nobody is saying it's fine.
Yes.
But it's also not true that there aren't resources or that the state, as you said, that the state walked away from mental health care in East Tennessee. Actually, the state is paying a lot of money for mental health care in East Tennessee.
Yeah, and one of the things when you're not from the Knoxville area, it's very easy to say and accurate in many ways to say, what's important is somebody is getting the care they need, and if they get the care they need at Moccasin Bend, then they're getting the care they need. The care is the thing. Well, of course, they're not. It takes people have to. There's the transportation of them down there and back, which costs the public at large a lot of money. The people who their loved ones here in Knoxville have to go to Chattanooga to see them. Those kinds of things. So there is a burden. Don't get me wrong. I don't. That's why I'm very careful to say people who aren't from Knoxville can say they are getting care, and they are. But it is. It would make a lot of sense, I think, in a lot of people's minds, to have another facility here, but if that's not the way that mental health treatment's been going,
right?
And it has been more. It is just the industry is more fragmented than it has been before, and there are hospitals coming up for specific populations that whether those are seniors or whatever, the industry nationwide has gone away from large institutions that treat everybody.
Right, more kind of specialized, different kinds of individualized treatment. That's the ideal model, of course. The question always is there enough? Can people who need it get it when they need it? All of those things, and those remain challenges.
Yeah, and the answer is there enough is no, as we mentioned before. That's one thing that everyone agrees on, is that more services are needed.
And just a little preview, we will have just a little bit of news next week on that effort to locate a new facility here in Knox County, and that's all I will say about that for the moment. Let's look ahead to the coming week. Not a tremendous amount going on. We do not have any of our regular meetings, county commission, city council, school board. None of them are meeting next week. There is an interesting meeting coming up on Wednesday of the Knox County Merit System Board of Directors, or what used to be called the Merit Council, which, as we have talked about some here, is the independent body that hears grievances from employees of the sheriff's office who believe that they have been treated unfairly or, suffered political retaliation and so forth, and also is involved in, helping to clear candidates for hire and so forth for the sheriff's office. They're having a meeting to talk about a couple of policy changes that would free up both employees of the sheriff's office and members of the board of directors for different kinds of political activity. And of course, this has been sort of an ongoing source of tension with the merit system for some years, whether or not it is a politically engaged body. And in reconstituting it as the Merit System Board of Directors last year, County Commission put some pretty strict rules in about political activity for members of the body, which is it's a volunteer board. And the way it's written right now, if you're on that board, you can't be involved in local elections, basically, period. They don't want people on that board involved in elections. So one of the changes that this board, which has now only been in its current form for less than a year, is talking about is limiting that to saying you can't be involved in the sheriff's race, but you could be, say, involved in a county commission race or some other kind of race. So they're looking to give themselves a little more leeway, not too long after county commission really put the clamps down on that. The other interesting thing that they're looking at changing right now, if an employee of the sheriff's office wants to run for political office, they have to take a leave of absence. And they're looking at changing that to say that you can be a serving full-time employee of the sheriff's office and run for office at the same time. So that'll be a little bit of an interesting conversation there. That's not a body that we necessarily cover all the time, but I'm going to go to that meeting next week and see what happens, and we'll let you know about that. And then Knoxville Utilities Board has a meeting of their Board of Commissioners next week.
Yeah, it's kind of a timing thing. One of the things about KUB's Board of Commissioners is, a lot of times, I tend to be the one to cover that. I make the decision once the agenda comes out as to what they're going to be discussing, is whether I'm going to cover that, because sometimes KUB has some very routine stuff that is not very newsworthy in itself. It's needed work, but they don't we can spend our time better reporting elsewhere. Usually that agenda comes out on Mondays, so I would say don't know what they're going to do, but with the tornadoes the tornado and the storms, the long-term outages, I would guess that they're going to be discussing the response there and what they did, maybe what they could have done differently, whatever. They'll probably have a discussion about that, so we'll sit in on that. And then there's also the preview of something going on statewide that we may have heard about. So.
Yeah, this past week, Governor Bill Lee finally issued his call for a special session beginning August 21st. And, of course, he had said this going back to April when the legislature adjourned without taking any action on some of the gun safety issues that Lee had raised after the Covenant School shooting in Nashville. He had said then he intended to call a special session on public safety, not just looking at firearms issues, but kind of looking at safety and mental health issues broadly. And he got a lot of pushback from the state Republican Party. Republicans in the legislature have kind of been trying for months to wave him off and say, you don't really need to call this special session. Don't call us back into session. We're not going to pass any of these gun safety things you're talking about. And just last weekend, the state Republican committee actually formally passed something, urging the governor not to call this special session. And, I think the backstory on that is that the Republican supermajority did not enjoy the last month of session when they were sort of beset for weeks by demonstrations and protesters coming and asking for some kind of response on gun safety in particular. Of course, that led to the whole Tennessee 3 blow up and everything that happened around that. And so I think a lot of the Republican legislators in particular are not really looking forward to going back to Capitol Hill and having all of those same people and protesters and signs and rallies and whatever all come back at the same time. Nevertheless, Lee did go ahead and call that session. So it will, and he outlined the issues that are, because if you call a special session, you have to identify the things that the legislature is going to talk about, and they can only talk about those things that are in that official call for the session. And so it does include a couple of the gun safety issues, in particular the temporary mental health orders of protection that he has talked about, which is sort of a version of red flag laws where a judge could decide that somebody is a threat to themselves or others and temporarily remove firearms from that person or restrict them from having access to firearms, which is something that gun rights groups very much oppose. That is on the list, but there's a lot of other things on the list too, having to do with safety at schools, having to do with mental health resources, some law and order items, for example, increasing the number of people over the age of between 16 and 18 who would be automatically tried as adults depending on the severity of their charges, that kind of thing. So the special session is going to happen, and we don't know what will come out of it, but that is on the horizon. Okay, well, I think that's all we have to talk about for this week. So for now, I'll just say thanks to Lord Seth Barber, our producer here at Barbarian Productions. Our theme music is by Will Wright. And take a load off. We'll talk to you next week.
Welcome to Compass Points, the weekly podcast for CompassKnox.com. CompassKnox.com is your best source for news and politics in Knoxville and Knox County. Your hosts today are Scott Barker and Jesse Mayshark, the founders of CompassKnox.com. You can find their daily in-depth coverage and subscribe at CompassKnox.com. The Compass Point podcast is brought to you in conjunction with Almost an Agreement. Almost an Agreement is a layman's attempt to get a handle on the workings in government and politics that we deal with every day. Check them out at almostanagreement.com or subscribe for free on your favorite podcast provider. If you'd like to learn more about the topics discussed on today's podcast, go to CompassKnox.com and subscribe for in-depth coverage and much more. And many thanks to William Wright for composing our theme song. Compass Points is a partnership of Barking Shark Media and Barbarian Productions, and recorded by Lord Seth A. Barber at Barbarian Studios, Knoxville, Tennessee.